Okay, so welcome back. We're continuing Masechtas Chagigah. We're up to the first page, so it's Daf base on the second side, so it's B, so it's 2B, the page number. Let me make this a little bigger. Okay, we finished last time. I think we finished right here. That Hillel retracted and he changed to say the same as by Shammai. When we learned that someone who was half slave and half free, that the master has to free him so that he can learn, so that he can live and marry and have a normal life. Good. So today we're continuing onto the next portion of the Mishnah. So quickly scrolling up to the Mishnah, we learned everyone is obligated Beriah, and we had this tool. You see my screen, right? You don't see my screen. Okay, let me fix this.
It says that you're presenting something, but I don't see it.
Okay, stop presenting. Present. Chagigah, share. You see it now? Did I lose you? It's showing on my hand. Let's close and subscribe.
I see it now. Good.
Oh, you see it now? Okay, good. Okay, so in the Mishnah we learned everyone is obligated Beriah. Beriah means we learned two different meanings that it could be, either with the actual going up to be seen and see in the Beit HaMikdash. Another thing it could mean is the actual offering. There's an offering that needs to be brought along, the oila, that has to be brought along, and that's what this means. Now the Gemara is moving on to the next few words in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says the first people who are exempt, someone who is a cheresh, a shaita, and a kutn. And this is the three things that we're going to get deeper into and to elaborate and to see what does it mean, whom does it represent, and all that. So coming back to the Gemara now. So we learned in the Mishnah, someone who's a cheresh, and the Gemara is going to explain what that means. Shoite, for now we say, is an imbecile, someone who you cannot understand what we tell him. The kutn is someone who is very small, very young. And the Mishnah already explained a different views as who's considered a kutn. So now the Gemara is going to take over. Ketuna, we learned somewhere in another Mishnah, that when the Mishnah says that someone who is a cheresh, he's exempt from having to go up to the Beit HaMikdash on the holidays, it doesn't mean every cheresh. It means such a cheresh that is similar to someone who's a shaita and a kutn, someone who's an imbecile. Now, what does cheresh really mean? Cheresh means someone who cannot talk, or maybe someone who cannot even hear. This is going to be the argument here. We know that people who cannot hear usually cannot talk either, because how would they learn to talk? Unless they once heard and now they can't hear anymore, so they can still talk. But people who can't talk can still hear. So the Gemara is saying right now that when we want to say someone who's a cheresh, it means someone who cannot do either or. He cannot hear and cannot talk. And that's why he's compared to an imbecile, someone that you can't teach him anything because you have no way of communicating to him, and he has no way of communicating back. So the Gemara explains it. Just like someone who's an imbecile or a kid that's so small that can't yet walk up, the lav bardaya, they are not, they don't have their own mind to make their decisions, to talk and to respond. Av cheresh de lav bardaya. We're also talking a bit about here a person who is a cheresh to the point that he does not have his own mind. He has no opinion on things because there's no way of communicating with them. So the question is now, if it's the same thing than shoyte v'kuten, then why does the Mishnah have to say cheresh as well? You're telling me all three, but now you're telling me, but the first one, cheresh, has to be similar to shoyte and akuten. Why do you have to say all three? Just tell me shoyte v'kuten. So the Gemara says, "V'kamash melan kedetnan," and this is the reason he's saying it is because it's coming to teach us something that we have learned. That what did we learn? So the Gemara is going to start, just go over that. That when we say the word cheresh all over in the Torah, in general, you should know that it means someone someone who cannot hear and cannot speak. But who medaber v'ayin shmaya, someone who can talk but cannot hear. Or shemaya ba'ayin medaber, he hears but he cannot speak. Chayev, they're still obligated. And the Yemud is saying this in general, not just in our halacha, in general throughout Shas or throughout anywhere you learn the halacha of a cheresh, you should know that that's what a cheresh means. So now the Gemara is going to go into the actual word. What does the actual word cheresh mean? And where do we learn? How do we know that it means that? So the Gemara goes in, Tanina Lahu, we learned on this, the Tuni Rabbunon. So Tanina Lahu is as to what we have learned, and then Tuni Rabbunon, the Rabbunon learned. Hamadaber v'ainu shemaya, someone who can speak but cannot hear, ze cheresh. That's called a cheresh. That's someone who is deaf and can't hear. Shemaya v'ainu medaber, he can hear but cannot speak. Ze ilam. Ilam in the terms of he's mute. He can't talk, but he can hear. And both of these, ze v'ze, meaning both of these, those who can hear and not talk, or those who can talk and not hear, both of these are considered as smart people to all the times when the Torah, or when the Chachamim, the sages say the term cheresh, they don't mean someone who can still do one. They mean only people who can't do either. So now the Gemara is coming to the next step. From where do we know the medaber v'ainu shemaya is cheresh? How do we know that the term cheresh is used for someone who can talk but not hear, which means he's deaf? In shemaya v'ainu medaber, someone who can hear and cannot speak, ze ilam, he's mute, he can't speak. So the Gemara is bringing a pusik from Tehillim, from the Psalm. The ksib, because it says, "Vani kecheresh eshmo," Vani and me, I kecheresh. This is the word cheresh being used. Lo eshmo, I won't hear. So it says that I won't hear like a cheresh. So you see, the word cheresh is being used to someone who's not hearing. And then the pusik, the verse continues, "Ilam lo eftach pi," and I will not open my mouth like someone who's called an ilam. So now you see an ilam is someone who can't speak. So there you see that the word cheresh means they cannot hear, and ilam means that they cannot speak. V'iboy Simon, another way I can bring you and show you what those words mean. How do I know that cheresh means someone who cannot hear, ilam means someone who cannot speak? Like people say, it's like an acronym. You have ilan is spelled with aleph, lamet, mem. Ishtalak miller means his words has been taken away from him. Ishtalak is an Aramaic, taken away. Miller means the words, and this is an ilan is an acronym to this, and therefore this is another sign for you to understand that ilan means someone who can't speak, and cheresh means someone who can't hear. So this is the Gemara. And I want to take a pause here. And I want to say, what in the world? What's going on here? What have we just witnessed? What are we learning? What am I taking away of this? Is this a storybook? It's not even a story. So what's going on here? And why can't the Gemara just tell me straight out? Oh, you're wondering what Cheresh is? Cheresh means this, and Ilah means this. Why is the Gemara bringing me proofs for everything and working out so many different ways here? So I'm not going to do this every time, but right now, when we start the Masechta, I'm going to stop and point out how the Gemara works with us. So remember, the Gemara is not here to give us the halachas. The Gemara is here to help us, our brains develop how to learn, how to understand ourselves, so that when something comes along and we don't understand, we don't know what we're reading, how do we decipher it? How do we decrypt it? If it's encrypted, how do we decrypt it? How do we get to know what are we talking about? So what I take away here is the Gemara is teaching me, when you reach a word in the Mishnah that you don't understand, for example, the word cheresh, what does cheresh mean? There's multiple layers. There's layers of how to go about to figure out what does the word cheresh mean. The first way to do it is to see if there's any other place in Shas where the sages explain what it is. If they themselves explain it, then what else do I have to look for, right? They're explaining it. And that's the first level when we see Tanin Lelahu, as we learned, that someone who speaks and doesn't hear, or someone who hears doesn't speak, what they're called for. So therefore, this is the first way to go. Now, what if you don't find? What if you don't find somewhere where the sages explain a certain word, but yet this word is foreign to me? I don't know what it is. The second thing to do is to try to find a verse in the Torah where this word is being used, so that you can figure out, that's what this word means. So therefore, the Gemara continues on saying, now how do we, as the sages, when we already explained to you what it means, how do we know what it is? So they go and they point to the verse in Psalms, in Tehillim, where it says, a cheresh cannot hear, and a ilam, someone who cannot speak. But the Gemara is not done yet. The Gemara says, what if you don't find? What if I don't find a verse in the Torah that uses this exact word? Then the Gemara says, okay, then try to think of this word as an Aramaic, as can it translate something? Can it mean something? Like in our case, it's a acronym for Ishtilik Milila, that his words has been taken away from him. So this is a lesson for us here. The Gemara could have told us right away what it means, or the Gemara could have just ignored, not even going into explaining what it means. But the Gemara didn't do that. The Gemara explained what it means and gave us 3 levels as how to figure how they figured out what it means. And to teach us that when we learn ourselves Gemara or Mishnayos or something, and we don't know what we learn, we don't understand a certain word, this is the process. This is how the more you learn, the more words you'll learn to pick up, and you'll be able to compare one to another as to where else the Gemara is explaining this word. Now, there's one more coin to this, the other side. Meaning, what if I did not find somewhere in Shas that the sages would explain this word? I also did not find a verse in the Torah. So to me, this word sounds like, I don't know, XYZ. But later on, as the years go by, I learn, and I find a pusik somewhere. What happens now is that overrides my previous learning. Why? Because it's in these layers. When the sages explain something, that's the best explanation. If I don't find the sages themselves explaining it, then I have to find a verse in the Torah that uses that word. If I don't find that, only then I can maybe try to say this word sounds to me something, if this is what I make out of it. But the minute I find a posuk in the Torah that overrides it, now I say for certain this is what the word means. So this is what I take away from this Gemara, that it's layered. And the Gemara is teaching us how to learn, teaching us what comes first and how to figure out a word. Any questions? Was good here? Okay, so we'll continue. So now we're moving on to this idea that we just heard. We just learned that Hamadaber v'aynu Shemaya or Shemaya v'aynu Medaber Chayev, meaning someone who can speak but not hear, or he can hear and not speak, he's obligated to go. The Gemara is going to ask him that. Tanya, but we learned in another Mishnah, Hamadaber v'aynu Shemaya, someone who speaks and cannot hear, or Shemaya v'aynu Medaber, someone who hears and cannot speak, Puter is exempt. So we have an outright contradiction to what we just learned. And the Gemara is pointing it out to us that there's another place where we see that. So the Gemara answers, Ravina, and this is the second time we have Ravina now in this tractate. Remember in the beginning we had Ravina who initially said someone who was half slave and half free, he's exempt from going. He has to be fully free. That's what we learned from Ravina. And I'm not going to scroll up because I won't lose my place. So Ravina is now coming and explaining it. The time and Reuven, those are who say that Reuven said it. Chasida Mixera, that the Mishnah is missing something, and we have to read the Mishnah differently. And this is how we need to read the Mishnah. And we're talking about our Mishnah. So let's see how our Mishnah is going to transform now and become something a little bit more detailed with more information. So the Mishnah goes like this: everyone is obligated to go up to be seen in the Beis Hamikdash and to bring the offering, and with happiness, in general, happiness, being happy, Yom Tov. Hitz mecheresh, someone who's a cheresh, which means hamadaber v'ayne shemai, is someone who can speak but cannot hear, or shemai v'ayne medaber, he can hear but cannot speak. Sheput min riyah, which he is exempt from riyah, and even though he's exempt from having to go up to be seen or to bring the offering, he's still chayev b'simcha, he's still obligated for simcha. And what if he's such a cheresh that he cannot do either one of them? V'shoyte v'kutne, someone who is an imbecile or small, puter af min simcha, they are also exempt from having to be happy. Why? The Mishnah explains, because they are exempt from all the mitzvahs that we learn in the Torah. Therefore, they are also exempt, someone who cannot do both, cannot speak and cannot hear. Now I'm going to take another pause here. As I said, it's the beginning of the Masechta, and I want to point out the way the Gemara works with us. Not just the contents that it's giving us, but reading between the lines. What is it doing with us here? And not only what is it doing with us here, I'm going to ask a very bothersome question, something that bothers me in generally. Would you ever see an author that writes a book and then comes out with another book, makes a whole series of it, and then in book number 5, he contradicts something that he wrote in book number 1? Would you ever see him coming out and pointing it out to his readers? I don't think he would. And if he would come back with an excuse saying, if I have the contradictions of 2 Mishnahs, then I have to explain myself. This was one Tana, this was another sage, and they were arguing there's 2 different opinions, and therefore there's 2 Mishnahs. The Gemara does that many times. But the Gemara doesn't do that here either. The Gemara doesn't even say that he retracted. This was the first opinion, and then it changed the second opinion. No. You know what the Gemara does here? The author says that I botched up on the first book. I didn't write well. I missed something. It's missing from that first book, and now I'm writing it in more detail. And if that's the case, then why don't you just go back to the first book and rectify it, fix it? Right? So here we're reading the Torah written by the sages, and they're asking the question that the Mishnah is contradicting one another, something that they wrote, and they're not even explaining it in a way that both are right. No, they're saying that we botched up the first time. It's missing something in there. So why don't you just go back and fix it? So the lesson that I want to say here is the Gemara again is teaching us, number one, when you're in pursuit of the truth, if you want to learn what's the truth in the Torah, then there's no there's no me. There's no I wrote something wrong and now I have to come back and fix what I wrote. There's nothing with me. It's the process of pursuing the truth. And the truth is never afraid of a question because it's the truth. And the fact that I don't understand something doesn't make the truth different. It's just my journey of figuring out the truth. So when the Gemara wrote something in the first Mishnah, and now the Gemara wrote something more detailed in the second Mishnah, the Gemara isn't going back to fix the first Mishnah. In contrary, the Gemara is pointing it out to us, saying that these are things that may happen because we're human. Things may happen in our journey in finding the truth, getting to the truth. But that's never changing the truth. It's just us trying to discover the truth, getting to the truth. And that's what the Gemara is showing us here, that they're so transparent with their work. If there was something wrong there, they'll show it out. They'll show you that, yes, it's missing. And when you find two Mishnahs outright contradicting each other, then sometimes the answer is that it's missing in another Mishnah. Now, this is not something they can teach us to do, because we have no right to come to a Mishnah and ourselves add something to the Mishnah saying, okay, it's got to be something missing in the Mishnah. We don't have that power, but they do, because they were the ones who wrote it. So they can come back and say it. But at least they're showing us the transparency, how this process came about in pursuing the truth and asking questions and not being afraid of the questions, even though it's going to point out that, yes, we missed out something there and there's more details that needs to be said. So that's a very powerful message that I take away from this portion. Now, again, I'm not going to do this on every little piece of the Gemara, but I want to point out when it's something so striking. Okay, so now the Gemara is very happy with his answer. The Gemara is even bringing proof that this is how the Mishnah is to be. As the Gemara says now, continues, that we can... Oh, I should have paused a second. Do you have any questions? We're good. Okay, so Tanya Namahocha, we also learned like this, that everybody is obligated with both. Riyah, meaning that you have to come up to be seen, and Besimcha, to be happy. Let's just keep the simcha right now, means just being happy. The Gemara is later going to elaborate as how to be happy and what actions we do to bring on happiness. Someone who's a cherish that can talk but cannot hear, or Shemai v'ayna medaber, someone who can hear and cannot talk, which a person like that is exempt from coming for Riyah. And even though he's putter, he's exempt from the first one, from a Riyah. Now we're going over to page 3a. He's still obligated with happiness. And now we go on to the end. Someone who cannot hear and not speak, or v'shoite, or v'kuten, someone who is a shoite, or he's a kuten, they are exempt even from happiness. Since they are exempt from all the mitzvahs given in the Torah. So now the Gemara has brought proof as to what the process is, as brought proof that this is what the Mishnah is really meant to say. Now the Gemara is taking this to the next step. How do I even know that the mitzvah of Riyah needs something stronger than versus the mitzvah of Simcha, which everyone is obligated? Versus the mitzvah of Riyah, you have to be someone who's seeing and hearing. If you can't do one, you're already exempt. How do we know that? And here is going to come. I'm going to finish with this. Let me see how far it goes. Yeah, I'm going to go up to here. It's a little bit more. I don't know if I'm over time today or not. But I'll go to there because it's still the same topic of hearing and speaking. So the Gemara is now asking, how do I know? Lost my place. What's the difference? How do I know that for Riyah they're exempt? And why, when it comes to being happy for Simcha, they're still obligated? So the Gemara is now teaching us the Indian Riya. We learned that Gumma Riya Riya Mahakal. Okay, so here I want to take a pause and explain as to how the Gemara is using. We know there's 13 ways of how to learn the Torah. 13, I misspoke. It's 13 ways of how to decipher the words in the Torah. The Torah itself is very abbreviated. It's like taking notes in the middle of a lecture, middle of a class. You take notes. You don't write every word because you have to keep up with the speaker. But there's a lot of hints within the Torah as to what you would learn from one another. And that's 13 rules that we have on how to learn from the Torah in comparisons. One of the things to learn is Gzeira Shuvah. Gzeira Shuvah means when we see a certain word being used in the Torah more than once, let's say in two places, and especially if it's a certain word that it's extra, doesn't belong there, we could have understand that verse without this particular word. Or if the word is something out of line, the Torah could have used a better term to explain what it wanted to say. Then we can use those two words to compare these two halachas from one another. So there's another place in the Torah where we see the Indian of Riyah. We know there's a mitzvah in the Torah every 7 years. That's usually done the Sukkot after a Shemitah, a sabbatical year, that all the Yidden have to come up to the Beit HaMikdash. This is not part of the Yom Tov. It's part of something else. It's something called Hakai. It's not the Riyah, it's called Hakai, where the whole nation, everyone, men, women, and kids, everyone has to come up, and the king would read a portion from the Torah in front of them, so that everybody hears a part of the Torah read. That's the mitzvah of Hakai. And when the Torah explains that mitzvah, the Torah gives us more details for when the Torah explains the mitzvah of Riyah. So that's why we use the word Riyah, that's being used in both of these mitzvahs to compare certain halachas from one another. So here the Gemara is using the word Riyah from both of these places to learn that by the mitzvah of Hakai, where all the Yidden are obligated to come up here, the king read from the Torah. Over there, we know that someone who cannot hear or cannot talk is exempt. Therefore, I will take the same thing for the mitzvah of Riyah, that they're also exempt. So how do we compare? So the Gemara is going to bring the actual verse, the chsid, because we say in the pasuk, Hakal esawam wa anushim v'nushim v'tav. You should gather up the whole nation, men, women, and kids. And the chsid, and it says, "B'voy kol Yisrael le'ruos." You do it in the time when the whole nation comes to see, which is ruos, which means to be oiler regel. And therefore, we use the word ruos by the mitzvah of Hakai, and we say Riyah by the mitzvah from being oiler regel. We can learn that someone who cannot hear or cannot speak is exempt from Riyah, but they're not exempt of Simcha. So the Gemara goes now to the next step. So we learn Riyah from Hakai, but how do you know by Hakai that someone is exempt, someone who cannot hear or speak? So Manula. And how do you know when it comes to the mitzvah of Hakai, when the whole nation has to come together, everyone, that someone who cannot listen, someone who cannot hear or cannot speak is exempt? So the Gemara says, because it says in the pasuk that says, "Leman yishmi, leman yilmedi." You know why everyone should come up to hear from the king? So that you should hear and you should learn. Yishmi means hear, and yilmedi means to learn. V'tanya, and we learned leman yishmi, for someone. The reason is so that you should hear. So the Torah is now telling us, prat lemedaber v'ayna shemaya. Someone who can speak and cannot hear, he's exempt. Because the Torah says clearly, you have to come up there so that you should hear what the king is reading. And someone who can't hear is exempt. And the second part of the pasuk, so that you should learn, that means someone who cannot speak, someone who can hear and cannot speak. Now the Gemara attacks this right away. Wait a second. You're telling me someone who cannot hear is considered the Eino Shemai. He can't hear. Get it. But you want to tell me someone who cannot learn means he cannot speak? If he cannot hear, I can hear that he can't learn because you can't speak to him. But how would you take from Leman Yilmidi for him to be able to learn that he cannot speak? It's on the contrary. So the Gemara asks right away, Lememra, so you want to tell me the Hiloi Mishtua Loikuma, somebody who cannot speak, cannot learn? And the Gemara is going to bring a very sad story here with a happy ending. So the Gemara says, Vohana Trai Elima, there were these two youngsters, they were two people that they couldn't speak. Elima means they were mute. The Hava, the Rebbe, they were living in the neighborhood of Rebbe. Some say, Benai Berate de Rabbi Yochanan ben Gidade. Some say that they were the sons of the daughter of Rabbi Yochanan ben Gidade, meaning that they were his grandkids. And some say, Benai Achosa de Rabbi Yochanan. They are kids to the sister of Rabbi Yochanan, meaning they were Rabbi Yochanan's nephews. And the story goes on. The whole aim is to have a oil Rebbe lebay midrasha. Every time when Rebbe would come to the Bes Medrash, have a ulai, they would come along. The Yozva Kamai, and they would sit in front of Rebbe, and they would shake their heads when they're listening. And they were shaking their mouths as if they're trying to speak, but they weren't able to speak. And Rebbe looked at them, and Rebbe had rachmunus on them, seeing that they're sitting here, they want to learn. No one knows if they learn or not because they can't speak, but they try to speak. They try to shake their mouths. They're shaking their heads. So what? Iboye Rebbe rachma Elohim. So the Rebbe davened for them, and they got healed, and they started talking. And then we found out the have a gemide hilchase the sifru the sifrai the hilatamida. We found out suddenly they can start speaking, and we found out they know everything. They know halachas, they know sifri, they know all of Shas. The hilatamida, they know everything. So how can you tell me somebody who can't speak cannot learn when we saw people who couldn't speak, and yet they learned so much because they hear they can still learn? Mazitra comes in and says, yes, you can learn when you cannot speak, but the pusik could be pronounced differently. So in Hebrew, the letters from Yilmidi and Yilamdi is exactly the same. It's just the nukudot that changes, the pronunciation, how the word is being pronounced. So the Gemara says, don't say Yilamal Yilmidi that they should be able to learn. Say Yilamal Yilamdi. They should be able to teach. They should be able to learn to others. That you can't do without talking. That everyone agrees. You can learn without talking, but you cannot learn to others without talking. For that, you need to be able to speak. And therefore, we learn from this pasuk that you're exempt. If you cannot speak or cannot hear, you're exempt for the mitzvah of Hakal. The same thing would be for the mitzvah of Riyah, that you'd be exempt if you cannot do one of them. Now the Gemara takes this whole long story and puts it on his head, basically saying that it's, of course, that's the reason. Rav Asher says, of course you have to say it's Lama Yilamdi. It's the same thing we have learned it, but put it down like in a two-liner. Saying Lama Yilamdi, it has to be Lama Yilamdi. You know why? If you want to tell me that it means that you should be able to learn the Kivin Deloy Mishtur Loiguma, because you cannot hear, you cannot learn. The Kivin Deloy Shuma, the Kivin Deloy Mishtur Loiguma, because you cannot speak, you cannot learn. The Kivin Deloy Shuma Loiguma. If you cannot hear, that's why you cannot learn. But not speaking doesn't stop you from learning. And what's the problem from not hearing? Maybe it means you cannot hear. That can be, because I'm high, Laman Yishmi Inafka. We have two parts. We have Laman Yishmi, Laman Milmadi. Yishmi means you have to hear. Yilamdi means you have to learn, be able to teach. So Rav Asher says it has to mean teaching. It cannot be learning, because if it means learning, that would only mean that you can't hear, But not hearing, we already know from the first part of the pasuk when it says Laman Yishmi. Therefore, of course, it needs to mean that you cannot teach. So this is where we'll stop. A very interesting Gemara. And the Gemara basically went behind now. Until here, we went just to teach how to pronounce the words. What does these words mean? Now that we have stated the halacha, the Gemara now explained where did I get to this halacha? Where did I come about, and how's the thought process of coming up with halachas, learning from one place to another place, and comparing and seeing who's obligated and who's not obligated. So we're going to pause here. I think I already said plenty of what takeaways we have here. So I'm going to jump back here. Any questions first from you? We're good? Okay. So let me